Welcome everybody to the Newcastle Institute this October. We're very lucky that we're focusing on the dismissal of the Whitlam Government 50 years on in November, for those people that remember. And we're just very privileged to have two amazing speakers, two eminent historians in Australia to speak about this. You're probably familiar with both of these people from media. Frank has been here previously, but they're just so knowledgeable about this era of politics and the Whitlam dismissal in particular, and I think it'll be an amazing night. First, let me introduce Emeritus Professor Jenny Hocking. You may be familiar with her. A deserved clap, I think, for the work that Jenny has done. Jenny is an award-winning biographer, inaugural Distinguished Fellow, Whitlam Fellow at the Whitlam Institute at Western Sydney University. Her books include the acclaimed two-volume biography of Gough Whitlam, on my left here, you can see it, shortlisted for numerous literary awards and winner of the Fellowship of Australia Writers Barbara Ramsden Award. Her latest book, The Palace Letters, The Queen, the Governor-General and the Plot to Dismiss Gough Whitlam, tells a story of her successful High Court action against the National Archives of Australia. It might be dropping in. To release secret palace letters between the Queen and the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, regarding the dismissal. We're still having, I'll try this one. The explosive revelations, is that better? Their explosive revelations of the Queen and Prince Charles' roles in Kerr's decision to dismiss Whitlam have transformed the history of the dismissal. The Palace Letters has been described as a political thriller and riveting, vital Australian history. An ABC TV documentary based on the book, The Search for the Palace Letters, screened in 2024 and was shortlisted in the New South Wales Premier Award for History. With that CV, we are delighted to welcome Jenny here tonight for this presentation. Thank you, Jenny, for coming all this way from Melbourne. And here, to my right, we have Professor Frank Bongiorno, who is Professor of History at the ANU in Canberra and Distinguished Fellow of the Whitlam Institute at Western Sydney University. He's the immediate past President of the Australian Historical Association and President of the Council for Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, and a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, the Australian Academy of the Humanities. His latest book, Dreamers and Schemers, which is also here, I feel like a prop, A Political History of Australia, is a fascinating insight into politics from the beginning to Albanese and Morrison. Put them both on your Christmas list. I think I've taken Rob's line there. He's written widely on Australian politics and especially the Australian Labor Party. His other books include a bit of a change from the ones that I just mentioned: The Sex Lives of Australians, A History and the 80s, another one for the Christmas list. The Decade That Transformed Australia, which won both ACT Book of the Year. His Dreamers and Schemers political history also won that ACT Book of the Year and the Australian Political Students Association Henry Mayer Booker Prize. Frank recently collaborated in an updated edition of the late Mango McCullum's The Good, the Bad and the Unlikely Australian Prime Ministers from Barton to Albanese, and he's a regular contributor to media on Australia and politics. So welcome, Frank, and thank you for coming again from Canberra. We've had a lot of interest in this event tonight. Nearly everyone that I've spoken to about it starts off with, I remember where I was when that happened. So I remember where I was too. I was doing my final economics exams at university. I was in a little flat studying, interestingly, economics, focused on the Friedman papers that had come out, which was very strongly anti-tariff, and the reason tariffs aren't a good idea. Just thought I'd throw that in because of the irony of the situation. I was sitting at a green and white Formica table with a transistor, and listening to the breaking news music as I studied. I heard that noise that says breaking news. I had to walk to a phone booth to tell off some friends. No technology those days. So why are those recollections important? I think, like yours, it tells of the significance of the event in our history and our constitutional history. I think it's such a significant crisis where people remembered where they were. Second, I think it tells of a time. Universities at that stage were in exam time. And there, in the absence of technology, the ability to organise protests about it was limited, and universities were a big avenue for protests in those days, and had been motivated to do so over many things. I think the third thing was that the Whitlam election, the It's Time election, and I know we've got a T-shirt here for It's Time here, another prop for us, represented a significant change in the generation after many years of the Menzies election. It represented a new vision for Australia, and many people had voted for it because of that new vision, and we've benefited from that new vision, and to some extent we still do today, the legacies of Whitlam that you'll hear about. Free university education in those days, the end of conscription. I mentioned that to somebody a lot younger than me the other day, and they said, "What's conscription?" And I did go into the voting and the numbers that were called out on the radio. Lowering of the voting age to 18 in 74, 73, yep. The community health system, which some people may still benefit from. Multiculturalism, a focus on equality for women, no-fault divorce, Indigenous rights, so many things, and I'm sure you'll hear more tonight. So I think the importance of both the event constitutionally and the legacy of Whitlam is worth remembering 50 years on, because we must learn the lessons of history. So thank you, and I'll welcome Jenny first to give her presentation about this important time in our history.
Thank you, Robin, for such a lovely welcome, and thank you to the Newcastle Institute for asking me to speak today, and thank you all for coming. The dismissal at 50, I share Robin's surprise in a way that there is still such interest in a political event 50 years later, although perhaps after what we speak about today, there won't be so much surprise after all. It was a volcanic moment in our history. It changed the course of our history because of the way in which the Whitlam government was transforming Australia at that time, and is known as the government that modernised, created modern Australia, and there was still so much more to be done, and that was cut short by the dismissal. I too remember where I was when I found out about the dismissal. I was a university student, particularly interested and shocked by the media coverage that had been preceding the dismissal, and really in disbelief that a Governor-General could remove an elected government. And even though I wasn't studying politics and didn't study politics for a long time after that, I grappled with the notion that a democratically elected government could be removed by a Governor-General for a long time. What I do remember most clearly is my parents' response, after which my father broke our television. And that's because they were Labor supporters through and through. My father was the first in his family to attend university thanks to the post-war capacity that was given by the Curtin government for returned service people to go to university. And they had waited 23 years. As my father said to me once, every time at every election I voted in, the party that I did not support got in. And it seemed like a lifetime for 23 years. And I want to come back to that in a moment, because I think that unbroken Conservative record in government is a really important one and very telling for the dismissal. So Kerr's dismissal of Whitlam on the 11th of November 1975, using the highly contentious reserve powers of the Crown, has been described as one of the most controversial and tumultuous events in the history of the nation. The Governor-General, an appointed official with no electoral mandate, dismissed an elected government which retained its majority in the House of Representatives at all times, dismissed him without warning, just as the Prime Minister was advising him to call a half-Senate election. In Whitlam's place, Kerr appointed the leader of the Liberal Party, Malcolm Fraser, as Prime Minister. And Fraser, I should point out, as Leader of the Opposition, has no constitutional relationship with the Governor-General whatsoever. He's just the head of the party that lost the previous two elections as it happened, and who did not have a majority in or the confidence of the House of Representatives. So it was indeed an unprecedented use of the reserve powers. These are the residual powers, so-called, of the monarch, which were widely presumed to have been overtaken by the democratic sentiment that infused our Westminster-style democratic parliamentary system. In fact, the last British Prime Minister to have been dismissed by the Crown was Lord North in 1783. And because of the fact that they had not been used in close to 200 years, it was widely considered, although not conclusively, but widely considered, that the reserve powers had fallen into what's called desuetude legally, that is, withered away through lack of use, until, of course, Kerr kindly breathed new life into them. And we now carry that as part of the parcel of powers of a Governor-General, which is extraordinary. I think one of the reasons, and a key reason for the continuing fascination and at times still pretty heated disputation about the dismissal, is that so many of the details and even some of the basic facts about what happened were hidden to us at the time, and many of it was hidden to us for decades to come. And it's really only been in the last 2 decades that, as archives have gradually, and I have to say most begrudgingly, been opened, we've seen a very different story to the dismissal unfold. We might come back to that really quite troubling problem, the difficulty of getting access to archive documents during question time. However, despite what I see as the essential fragility of the still emerging history of the dismissal, one thing is clear, and that is that the dismissal as we understand it today is vastly different from what was initially seen and described quite simply. Has that dropped out? Yes. As the reluctant action. Sorry. If I had a louder voice. No. We might have to pause. This is not going to be. Is that one working? Let me try this. Okay. I'll go with this. Yep. The dismissal as we understand it today is vastly different from what was initially seen quite simply as the reluctant action of an isolated Governor-General. The veteran journalist Alan Reid said that Kerr reached an agonising decision as though he had no planning, no forethought, no options, when supply was blocked in the Senate, and who, as Kerr described it himself, made up his mind on his own part. And I'll come back to what we know today that we didn't know then. But first, let's just recap on what happened in the Governor-General study on the 11th of November 1975, nearly 50 years ago. The Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, arrived at Government House, Yarralumla, at 1 p.m. by arrangement with Kerr. They made that appointment that morning. He was there to sign off on the letter to state governors calling the half-Senate election, which he had agreed with Kerr and determined the correct wording of with Kerr just that morning. And Whitlam was to announce the half-Senate election in the House of Representatives that afternoon. As Whitlam handed his letter to Kerr, the Governor-General said, "I have a letter for you," and handed Whitlam a letter which he had already typed and signed, terminating Whitlam's commission and that of his entire ministry. Gough Whitlam described this to me as the greatest shock I had ever experienced. And the backdrop to the dismissal was that for the previous 4 weeks, since the 16th of October 1975, the opposition, that is the Liberal and National Country Party coalition, the opposition senators had refused to vote on the government's supply bills. They had instead passed an amendment returning those bills to the House of Representatives with the demand that the government, quote, submit itself to the judgment of the people. In other words, go back to the third election in 3 years and then we might pass supply before it would vote on the supply bill. So, supply had not been rejected. It had not even been voted on. It was in limbo as the Senate demanded that the other house, the lower house, go to an election. Which type of election was not actually specified in the motion that was passed. Now, the government's response to this uncharted situation was always to call the House-Senate election. This was the only election that was actually due at that time. And it was also, I should point out, the coalition's worst nightmare, for reasons which will, I think, become apparent. Whitlam had announced the intention to call a House-Senate election if supply continued to be blocked on the very day that supply was first blocked in October. A caucus meeting had reached the unanimous decision that if the opposition continued to block supply, the government would call a House-Senate election at a time of Whitlam's choosing. And by the 6th of November, that's what he had decided, and that's what Kerr knew he had decided. And this is why Whitlam always says his visit to Yarralumla was an ambush, because it was under the false understanding on his part that it was to finalise the House-Senate election details, which is a very complex process and is not something that is decided on the day at that moment. It requires different letters, different dates, and different requirements for each of the states, and territories are different again. But the simple narrative, nevertheless, from that day on, as I said, was that this was a solo act by the Governor-General, and in particular that Kerr had no other option but to dismiss the government, appoint the opposition to government, and call a double dissolution election. Seen in that light, Kerr's decision to dismiss the government was, in that view, entirely situational. In other words, it was contingent only on the fact that supply had been blocked. There was a sort of what I call an origin myth, which is that the problem that led to the dismissal began with the blocking of supply. But what I hope to show today is that no, it began really, as Graham Freudenberg said, with the election of the Whitlam government itself. Central to this apparently settled history, until the archival revelations that have told us otherwise, was that Kerr acted alone, that Malcolm Fraser did not know of his plans, and most insistently, that the palace was not involved. In fact, it was repeatedly claimed that Kerr protected the Queen by maintaining her ignorance of his thinking and planning for the dismissal. The Queen's Deputy Private Secretary, Sir William Heseltine, later claimed, quote, the palace was in a state of total ignorance. Total ignorance. Now, I've read all of the palace letters between Kerr and the Queen through her Private Secretary, Sir Martin Charteris. And having read them and read of their discussions about Kerr's consideration of dismissing the government, the use of the reserve powers, whether he has the power to do so, it's an absolutely staggering claim. It's clearly a false claim. And yet it's one that the palace persists with despite the release of the palace letters. The critical context to the dismissal is what we raised before, and that Robin raised, and that is that the election of the Whitlam government in December 1972 was the first Labor government in 23 years. And that, I think, as we see with the response of the opposition to that election, is extremely damaging for any polity. And I don't think it particularly matters which party is in office for 23 years, it's too long. And what it does is it creates a sort of a block in the system itself, an expectation of how things will be done, a sort of ossification in the processes in which the anticipated manner of government is the Conservative manner of government, because that's the way it had always been done, almost since the time of the Second World War. And of course you have the vast, immense figure of Sir Robert Menzies over most of that time period as well. So particularly among some of the senior ranks of the public service, not all, but famously with the head of the Treasury in particular, but others, which had all been geared towards and culturally in tune with the wishes of a rather quiet and certainly more slow-moving reactive coalition governments. They were not well equipped to deal with a new Labor government, and certainly not one as avowedly and determinedly reformist as the Whitlam Labor government. So there was already tension within the public service and other arms of government with the election. But for the Liberal Country Party coalition, or the Country Party as it was then, the election of the first Labor government in 23 years was nothing short of catastrophic. It sent them to the opposition benches for the first time in 23 years, and I think it's fair to say they were not happy. Their response was, I find, still quite extraordinary. They simply would not accept the new government's legitimacy, and they said that, nor its mandate to govern. They embarked on a strategy of obstruction that had never been seen before through the Senate from the earliest days of the Whitlam government. The opposition leader in the Senate, Reg Withers, described Whitlam's election victory as an aberration, as the result, he said, of the temporary electoral insanity of the two largest electorates, New South Wales and Victoria. I mean, what an insult to the Australian electorate. And he denied what he called the government's so-called mandate to govern. Because the Senate had not gone to an election in 1972, so when Whitlam came to power, he has in the Senate a body that was half elected nearly 5 years earlier in 1967, and the other half in 1970. They're from a different time, different political time period, at a time when politics is shifting quite dramatically. And that's what Whitlam had to deal with. Senator Withers promised that they would use the opposition's numbers in the Senate to force the Whitlam government to another election. And he promised that from the very earliest days of the new government. It's quite exceptional. If we have a look at that record of obstruction, you will see that, and I wanted to point this out, that on the one hand, while we have this extraordinary, unprecedented level of obstruction, you also have an extraordinary level of productivity from the government, and a remarkable number of bills managed to get through. So you see the Whitlam government introduce in each of its years the largest number of bills that had been introduced into a parliamentary session, 254 bills in 1973 and so on. And the Senate rejected 93 bills between 73 and 75. What is extraordinary is that this is more than the number of bills the Senate had rejected in the entire 71 periods preceding it, put together. I mean, it is quite remarkable. And it wasn't only through the Senate that this obstruction was felt. They challenged legally, wherever possible, government legislation, and ran increasingly toxic media campaigns against specific policies, particularly and memorably the campaign to bring in Medicare, Medibank as it was then. And the minister responsible, Bill Hayden, suffered enormously through that campaign. So I want to point out at the end that nevertheless the government passed 507 bills, those remarkable legislative changes that we still carry with us today. And a couple of the electoral ones I want to point out, because they passed at our one and only joint sitting after the 1974 double dissolution election, was the bills that enabled Medibank to be put into place. But the other are two really important electoral laws. One brought us what we see today as one vote, one value, where the electorates are only 10% variation between electorates, which I think is enormously important, as we can see compared to certain other countries, namely Trump, and where, you know, redistricting, as it's called, is quite shocking. And the other was and this was important in the dismissal, I'll discuss it, was for the first time giving Senate representation to the ACT and the Northern Territory. And that again passed at the 74 joint sitting, and really important in how the House Senate election was going to play out, because those 4 new senators would take their place. So, a quote that really stuck with me because how powerful it is from Bill Hayden about how the Parliament was, how he felt it was at that time, how difficult the opposition made it. He said the atmosphere generated was poisonous. He said it made governing impossible and intolerable, and they did this from the very first day we were in. And boy, the way they hated us when they were sitting on the opposition benches, the way they'd look at us and sneer hatefully. The atmosphere was poisonous, absolutely poisonous. We shouldn't be there. They always owned government. It's so powerful, and it gets to what I think is the personal dimension in so much of this, that he still remembered that so vividly decades later. Now, the dismissal rested on 3 interlocking elements. First, the opposition had to have sufficient numbers in the Senate to defer supply, not to reject it, to defer it, which required the passing of an amendment in order to defer. Secondly, the opposition had to have a leader willing and eager to do so. And finally, of course, it required a Governor-General prepared to ignore the advice of his former chief advisor, that is the Prime Minister, and to exercise instead the arcane and obsolete reserve powers of the Crown, a sort of return to feudal grandeur and the divine right of kings, to dismiss the government and put in one of his own choosing. Now, what is interesting, at least I find it interesting, is that just 18 months before the dismissal, none of those 3 core conditions was actually in place. So let's have a look at the process of what happened in the intervening 18 months leading up to the dismissal, what happened in order to put in place those core requirements that would then enable the dismissal to be done. Briefly, I mentioned the 1974 double dissolution, and I'm not going to go into great detail. Frank and I have written some really excellent papers for the Whitlam Institute about that election and joint sitting, which is on the Whitlam Institute website if you care to have a look. But the critical fact is that at that time, firstly, the opposition gave its first trial run of trying to block supply and moved to do so in the Senate. Why it didn't succeed is because it had a different Governor-General. The Governor-General was Sir Paul Hasluck, who worked closely with Whitlam, totally differently from Kerr, worked closely with Whitlam in putting together a process through which he would return to the Senate through his leader in the Senate, Lionel Murphy, with the Governor-General's what he called conditional granting of an election, the double dissolution election. And at that point, the Senate passed supply. It did not want to be seen as rejecting both the Governor-General and the government. Why Kerr did not follow that model in 1975 and why the media were not more alert to reminding him of this, only the age, I think, brought it to his attention, I do not know, except presumably a different outcome was desired. But the most important thing, outcome of the 1974 election was the electoral algebra in the Senate. The Senate was where all the action was. After the double dissolution, you will see that Labor picked up 3 Senate places, so too did the Coalition. The DLP lost all 5 of their Senate places and were a spent political force, much to Whitlam's delight. And there were also 2 others. There was an independent, Michael Townley, who promptly rejoined the Liberal Party from which he had come in early 75. So there were 30 votes in support of blocking supply at that point. And Steele Hall, who was a Liberal movement senator from South Australia, said he would never vote to defer, block or reject supply, so he was prepared to vote with the government. So that meant there was a split vote of 30-30. Now, the important thing about blocking supply is it requires a positive vote, that is 31, in order to pass an amendment that would return the bills to the House of Representatives demanding an election. And the opposition did not have one. They did not have a majority any longer in the Senate. So they could not at this point, with the Senate as elected in 1974, block supply. They could reject it by being 30-30, but they could not defer it. And the reason it really mattered, as I say there, that they could only reject it, is that everybody knew, and it's since become revealed through various, again, archival details, that there were what were called wavering senators. There were wavering Liberal senators who were very, very reluctant conscripts to this idea of blocking supply. They were prepared to go along with the party decision for a brief time only if it was to defer, but they were not prepared to reject supply. So the opposition's hands were tied at this point. There were two critical appointments that were fundamental to the dismissal being able to take place. The first was obviously a new Governor-General, and we have the appointment of Sir John Kerr on the 11th of July 1974. Now, he was certainly not Whitlam's first choice as Governor-General. Whitlam had approached Hasluck and really pleaded with him to stay on, but Hasluck did not, and then he approached, I think, 3 other people, including 2 of his own ministry, hoping that one of them would take the position. And in the end, he approached Kerr, his 5th choice. Kerr took several months of negotiation before he accepted the appointment. He negotiated an increase in salary, the introduction of a Governor-General's pension, and a larger clothing allowance for himself and Lady Kerr before accepting it. And you'll see in the Palace letters he's singularly concerned about these matters of dress, and he writes to Lord Charteris and asks him what he thinks he should wear to his own sort of inauguration, which I just find totally embarrassing. And Whitlam had said to him, well, I think it's fine to wear a normal lounge suit, which Charteris countermands and said, no, you're right to wear, what's it called when tails? Morning dress, your morning suit. You're right to wear a morning suit. So you have these wonderful photos of Kerr's admission as Governor-General where he looks unusual. He's in a top hat, long tails, standing at attention with his wife, who's extremely unwell and looks extremely unwell, next to him, and she died only a few months later, and Whitlam and Margaret Whitlam in fairly normal clothes. So it's, in itself, it's a snapshot of what this meant to Kerr. And interestingly, he also spoke during that time, before he accepted the position, to his close friends and colleagues, the High Court Justice Sir Anthony Mason and Justice Robert Hope. We now know that Mason played a critical role in Kerr's thinking and decision to dismiss the government, even writing a letter of dismissal for him, even though he was a High Court judge at the time, and kept that secret for 45 years until I found Kerr's details about this, and he was forced to come out and acknowledge it. There's a moral dimension to all of this that I find deeply, deeply unsettling, but that's another story. He also spoke to Justice Robert Hope, who many of you would know did the Royal Commission into Intelligence and Security, a very respected, highly respected lawyer. Both of them told Kerr that this was effectively a dead-end job and said, what on earth are you taking a job of the Governor-General? You're the Chief Justice of the New South Wales Supreme Court. But in those discussions, both of them interestingly recalled that Kerr was particularly interested in the reserve powers and drew their attention to it and said, oh no, this is a very powerful position, and this is before he took it up. So he's clearly got an interest in the possibility of power. The second appointment that was critical was that of Malcolm Fraser, who took over from the hapless Billy Snedden in March 1975. I mean, Snedden's days were numbered after the 74 election and the disaster that followed with the return of the Whitlam Government and the passage of the 6 trigger bills, which was what they'd been trying to avoid. And also, the death knell was that Snedden said he would not try again what he'd tried in 74 and try to block supply. And what that did was marshal the Fraser forces, who were very keen to block supply again, behind him, and he successfully, for the second attempt, challenged in March 1975. Fraser was seen as austere, ruthlessly ambitious, extremely conservative, and very keen to get rid of the Whitlam government. He was asked immediately whether he would do as Snedden had tried unsuccessfully to do and block supply. He said, "Oh no, the government's entitled to run its full term." And then he said one very important and, for the Whitlam government, fatal exception, except in the case of extreme reprehensible circumstances. Oops. And they were not the only critical appointments. There were two equally, but different, far more critical non-appointments, as I will call them. This was fundamental to the Senate makeup. Firstly, in February 1975, Whitlam appointed the Labor Senator Lionel Murphy QC to the High Court of Australia. Now, the convention that it held, ever since the introduction of, I think, proportional representation in the Senate, the convention was that the state government, through the parliament of whichever party that departing senator had come from, would replace the senator with someone of that party's same choosing. In other words, to maintain the electoral makeup that had been there at the previous election, to be proper about the appointment. Instead, the New South Wales Premier Tom Lewis said he was so outraged by the appointment of a Labor Attorney General to the High Court, despite the fact that Sir Garfield Bowery had been Menzies' Attorney General and External Affairs Minister and was appointed directly to Chief Justice of the High Court, but apparently it was shocking for Murphy to be so appointed, and instead the New South Wales Parliament appointed a former Mayor of Albury, Cleaver Bunton, who said he was an independent, and he was indeed, on this question, independent. Importantly, he said he would support the government on supply. So the opposition is back to square one. It does not have the numbers to block supply, but it has set a precedent. And so when the Queensland Senator Bert Milliner died on the 30th of June, the Queensland Premier Joe Bjelke-Petersen located a putative Labor member, Pat Field, who was from the extreme right of the Labor Party and who loathed Gough Whitlam and the Whitlam government and was promptly expelled from the Labor Party. And he said, "I went to Canberra for one purpose, to bring down the Whitlam government." So he was clearly keen to assist the opposition in blocking supply. This was called a tainted Senate, because what it meant was that through those two critical appointments, particularly the second one, Labor had lost a vital vote that it needed to prevent the blocking of supply, or conversely, that enabled the opposition to block supply. We know that from September 1975, Kerr's secret correspondence with the Queen showed that he began a series of discussions about using the reserve powers to dismiss the government, and he began that with Prince Charles, the Queen, her private secretary, Sir Martin Charteris. I won't spend any more time on this, except you can see that he had a detailed conversation with Prince Charles in PNG where the possible dismissal of the government is discussed from September. The half-Senate election was the only election due at that time, and that is what Whitlam decided to call. And the unique circumstances meant 6 of the new senators, the 2 replacement senators plus the 4 new ones, would take their place immediately. The others would come in the following July. That gave a window of opportunity where it did appear that Labor just might, it was still based on polls, but might gain control of the Senate till the following July. An important point is that the Solicitor General Sir Maurice Byers gave an opinion on the use of the reserve powers and on what the Governor-General's powers were at the height of the crisis. This was delivered to Kerr on the 4th of November 1975 and is absolutely clear that he sees no basis and advises Kerr there is no basis. Even the actual rejection of supply, let alone the threat of it, does not call for the Ministry to resign, nor compels the Crown's representatives, that is the Governor-General, to intervene. So Martin Charteris had already written to Kerr overriding this and stating, you have the power. That you have the power is known. And that is a direct contradiction to what Kerr is getting from his genuine Australian advisors. I will just move to the end because we're running out of time, as I always do. This is the letter that Whitlam was to deliver to the Governor-General on the 11th of November 1975. It's his signed letter. And this is the letter that Kerr gives him. I hereby determine your appointment as my Chief Advisor and Head of Government and your entire government. Now, the critical thing that is often forgotten, and I will end with this, is what I call the second dismissal. It's frequently forgotten that in that afternoon, the House of Representatives continued to sit, as did the Senate. Supply was passed in the Senate. This is how Whitlam planned to be back in government, as he told Margaret, I will be back in government this afternoon. The House of Representatives passed effectively a no confidence motion, a want of confidence motion in Malcolm Fraser as Prime Minister, and called on the Governor-General to commission to form a government made up from the member for Werriwa, that is Gough Whitlam. So the House of Representatives has spoken. It has passed a motion of confidence again in the Whitlam government. Supply has been passed. The Speaker is dispatched from the House to go to Government House and tell Kerr the House of Representatives has spoken. It wishes a Whitlam government to be commissioned, and the Governor-General refuses to see the Speaker. And conventions are torn up like confetti at this point. Fraser refuses to resign as Prime Minister even though he has not got the confidence of the House. The Governor-General refuses to see the Speaker, and the Governor-General at that point dissolves both houses, calls a double dissolution with Malcolm Fraser still in office. And I will just finish and summing up. I did have quite a bit more, but I've run out of time. But after many, many years of looking at this, I see Kerr as the last of the colonial governors. He saw himself as the font of a reservoir of uncapped discretionary power, responsible not to the Prime Minister as his chief advisor under the Westminster system, not to the Australian system of government, and certainly not to personal and political propriety in his relations with government, but as the protector, as he said to Sir Martin Charteris, as the protector of the monarchy. The things I did and the decisions I took, he told Charteris, were to protect the monarchy into the future. You can probably see why I believe that it's time for an Australian republic.
Thanks. That's up and down. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Awakabal and Warramai people and pay my respects to people, elders and country. Right, that's ready to go, is it? Yeah, terrific. Great. Okay, so look, since the 11th of November 1975, millions of words have been written about the dismissal of the Whitlam government. Almost all have told the story via an account of politicians, judges, the Governor-General and the Palace, and in relation to constitutional law, parliamentary convention and high politics. Ordinary Australians have usually figured in these stories mainly on the sidelines. Accounts of the dismissal from below, for instance, the strike, the march, demonstration and meeting, and indeed the recollection, which we're all looking forward to in question time. These have appeared, but are less common, I think. Now, with my colleague James Watson, and here I need to acknowledge to the support of the Whitlam Institute for the research on which this is based. I've written an account that seeks to recapture the dismissal as an event that engaged the emotions and commitments of those we're calling ordinary Australians, whoever they might be, on both sides of the controversy, and to explore the dismissal's role in mobilising social and political movements, interest groups, protest, and of course affirmation as well. So our aim is to recover the dismissal and the anti-Kerr protests that of course extended into 1976 1976 in particular, less as a unique historical event, as Jenny's pointed out, but you know, as an emblematic and supremely important example of the wider popular politics of protest at the time. We need to recover the dismissal, I think, as part of a more expansive sense of the possibilities of democratic citizenship in the 1970s. A citizenship that wasn't just about Parliament. It's about what's happening, you know, in broader society, in you know, the social movements. It's you know, not simply a matter of voting in Parliament. And to see, I think, also in the course of the protest movements of 1975-76, a harbinger of the disarming, I think, of a lot of the radical hopes that the Whitlam government actually embodied. So this is also, I think, a story that prefigures the 1980s and beyond. So let me talk a little bit about the background, and here I'm slightly encroaching on Jenny's territory. By the winter of 1975, the Whitlam government had developed in some quarters a reputation as a profligate and incompetent government. You know, this is obviously a line that's being run very widely in the media. The blocking of supply is being widely discussed. It's being widely discussed in the media, it's there in the palace letters and so on. When Malcolm Fraser was elected Liberal leader in March 1975, he signalled that the coalition senators would only block supply in the most extraordinary and reprehensible circumstances. Now, Fraser, of course, found these so-called extraordinary and reprehensible circumstances in the loans affair, which I won't discuss in detail, but that became critical to his case, public case for blocking supply. On Thursday, the 16th of October, the coalition used its numbers in the Senate to defer supply. That's the text, most of the text of the amendment that was moved by Senator Robert Cotton. In response, and here I go into you know, the protest movement. The massive, powerful and militant Amalgamated Metal Workers Union, probably about 185,000 members at that time, held spontaneous strikes in New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. Sydney members of the Waterside Workers Federation announced a 24-hour stoppage for Friday. 1,000 of them marched from the union rooms to a rally addressed by Whitlam and Bob Hawke, then of course both ACTU and ALP president, that was held in Hyde Park. And Waterside workers walked off the job in other cities as well. So this is the response to the blocking of supply, not to the dismissal. So we're not talking about a protest movement that only somehow emerges on the 11th and beyond. It's there in mid-October. Outside Parliament House in Canberra on the Thursday, while the budget bills were being considered by the Senate, there was a rally organised by local unions. Again, Hawke addressed the crowd, estimated at about 2,500, and it was said to be made up of public service demonstrators, a very dangerous lot, as we know. Hawke told them that if the opposition refused to pass the budget, and I quote from Hawke here, the Australian trade union movement may very well think about withholding supply from them. Now, was that a threat of a general strike? Probably not, given that the meeting had specifically considered and then rejected a motion for such an action. Still, Doug Anthony, the National Country Party leader, accused Hawke of incitement to lawlessness, an accusation that was echoed in conservative press such as The Australian. Now, the role played by the perceived potential, and this is central to the argument I want to put, the role played by the perceived potential for social disorder and even violence in the events leading up to the dismissal has been underestimated by historians. At the beginning of October, with blocking of supply on the opposition's agenda, but not yet, of course, an openly discussed policy, there was an open letter, widely quoted in the press, that came from the Liberal movement Senator Steele Hall, former Premier of South Australia. He warned Fraser that he, Fraser, and the coalition would fail to build a popular base for his leadership if the community, and I quote, contained the bitter and growing discontent of Labor supporters who who believed the ballot box had lost its democratic function. Sir John Kerr, writing shortly after the first rallies and strikes following the blocking of supply in mid-October, told Sir Martin Charteris, and I quote, "As the money runs out, many problems will arise and the reaction of the trade unions has to be considered. There are threats of protest strikes and industrial war." Ian McPhee, leading Victorian Liberal moderate, wrote a couple of weeks later along similar lines, "If the coalition won an election," and I quote, "stemming from the present crisis, we will have the outright hostility of nearly 50% of the electorate." McPhee worried especially over the unions which, and again I'm quoting, "would feel justified in destroying our government as they believe the Senate destroyed their government." He's already looking forward to what a post-dismissal order might look like. "The confrontation involved," said McPhee, "was frightening to contemplate," his words. The Labor Senator John Wheeldon told the Senate during the debate on the budget on 16th of October, and again I'm quoting, "The government has been trying to maintain the economy of this country on an even keel by advocating wage indexation and by restraint in public expenditure. If we are removed, will opposition members be able to convince the Amalgamated Metal Workers Union or the Miners' Federation to restrain their wage demands? Why should the Amalgamated Metal Workers Union or the Miners' Federation restrain their wage demands if they know that they are living in a society where anything goes, that is, where the rule book has been ripped up by the coalition?" Fear of violence and disorder was real. I could multiply examples, I won't. Nonetheless, the rallies and protests that were held in the immediate wake of the blocking of supply were mainly orderly and peaceful. Now, the Senate blocked supply again on the 22nd of October. Each side sought to mobilise support outside Parliament. On the 26th of October, 3,500 attended a migrant rally for Whitlam at the Melbourne Town Hall. On the same day, 12,000 people filled Randwick Racecourse's grandstands for a Liberal Party rally. A few hundred Labor supporters also turned up to that event and scuffles broke out. Labor disruptors had a greater impact at Brisbane's Festival Hall on the 31st of October. Here, Labor supporters on the side jeered the band and speakers and they waved their placards. When Liberal MP John Hughes tried to remove one, he was punched in the stomach and on the nose, and his bloody face appeared on the front page of the Courier Mail the next morning. It was an ugly confrontation. It exposed the danger of peaceful protest degenerating into physical violence amid an increasingly passionate politics. Now, all of this is well before the dismissal. Okay? So, many Australians, and we've talked about this already, Robin earlier, many Australians would later remember where they were when they first heard the story of the dismissal on the 11th of November, and they usually reported a sense of shock or disbelief. I was 6 and was in grade 1 at school, so I'm afraid I can remember Whitlam being Prime Minister, and I can remember Whitlam not being Prime Minister, and I believe the Queen had had something to do with it. I remember that much. So I was well ahead of the curve, Jenny. Whoops, didn't need to go upstairs, but we've been taught by Miss Smith in grade 1, and I'm afraid the dismissal was mainly off the agenda. But anyway, many Australians would remember what they were doing. Some simply could not believe what others told them they'd heard over the radio. Surely they were mistaken. When the news did sink in, some were relieved, others were angered, but anyone with even a basic appreciation of the country's political culture understood that they were witnesses to something unusual and momentous. A young journalist, Nikki Sava, described the scenes in Canberra that followed Fraser's parliamentary announcement of the fact that he'd become caretaker Prime Minister as memorable, awesome and frightening. Demonstrators, of course, began assembling outside Parliament House, a few thousand by late afternoon, with smaller numbers going to Government House at Yarralumla, where they lowered the flag to half-mast. Canberra protests were peaceful on the whole, although demonstrators yelled out "Zig Heil" to coalition politicians and invited those politicians watched from the balcony to jump. When Fraser walked down the building's famous steps to visit Government House, of course, for the second time that day, he was loudly jeered and some protesters did their best to punch him. Angry crowds also surged around Fraser's car on his return from Yarralumla. Good humour infused the remarkable appearance of Gary McDonald in character as Norman Gunston, who travelled from Sydney to join the excitement when news reached the ABC offices of the dismissal. Now, Gunston, of course, as I'm sure most of you would know, was a popular comic figure on the ABC, and his appearance outside Parliament had clearly delighted the crowd, to whom he made a well-received and rousing speech, asking if the dismissal was, and I quote, an affront to the constitution of this country, or just a stroke of good luck for Mr. Fraser, presumably confusing the Prime Minister with the boxer. That people, even a leading player such as Bill Hayden, could find humour in these moments of high tension probably says more about the basic serenity of the country's politics than any detailed study of the more aggressive forms of protest that is my main topic. Now, while Australia's stock exchanges went berserk at the news of the dismissal and launched the biggest buying spree since the Poseidon business, the Poseidon bubble of 1970, the events of the 11th of November raised the spectre of serious civil violence for the first time really since the Depression of the 1930s. A pro-Whitlam protest in Melbourne at the Liberal Party headquarters on the afternoon of the dismissal erupted into one of the most violent demonstrations ever seen in the city, according to the Australian anyway, as protesters clambered over police cars and, quote, kicks and punches were freely given. Police were led from the taunting crowd, bleeding from head wounds and with their shirts torn. A police wagon drove through the melee, knocking down protesters and police, while a horse repeatedly used to charge through the protesters was battered with sticks and stones. Glaziers refused to fix the broken windows of the party offices. Oh, good members. In Sydney, about 2,000 marched on the 11th, mainly scuffles but no arrests, and there were smaller protests in Adelaide and Brisbane also on that day. On the following day, the 12th of November, there were further street protests with some low-level violence. More than 1,000 maritime workers marched on the Sydney Stock Exchange, where demonstrators bearing placards knocked police aside as they surged into the foyer in the hope of a further advance onto the trading floor. Unfortunately, the would-be revolutionaries took a wrong turn, lacking familiarity with the building, so there would be no revolution in Sydney that day. About 2,000 unionists marched 7 abreast down Queen Street in Brisbane to Liberal Party headquarters. A rally in Brisbane's King George Square of somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 Whitlam supporters, many striking unionists, erupted into wild brawls with the small coterie of Liberals present. Speakers condemned Kerr the traitor, Fraser the fascist, and Bjorky Peterson, that mad Dane. 1,000 members marched, 1,000 members maintained a sit-down that blocked traffic in Melbourne, where students in the city square melodramatically renamed the country the Democratic Republic of Australia, complete with Eureka flag. Now, all these protests were modest in scale, and while there were expressions of concern from political, industrial and church leaders about the potential for violence, there was in truth little here that should have worried anyone terribly much, I suppose, unless you were a bleeding policeman. On Friday the 14th of November, nearly 50,000 streets, however, across various cities of the nation, but only in Melbourne, again, was there disorder, and even that was on a modest scale. A window of the exclusive Melbourne Club, to which Fraser belonged, was a casualty, while other demonstrators unsuccessfully tried to storm the stock exchange down there. I don't know if they found the trading floor or not. Maybe they had a map. Now, let me move on to talk a little bit more about unions. At a time when about 55% of workers belong to trade unions, by far the greatest potential for social disorder came from the possibility of mass industrial action, not from what I've been describing. The decade of the 70s was a period of significant labour movement militancy, and not all of it was securely under the control of union leaders, and that's important to consider in all this as well. Ideas of industrial democracy, shop floor militancy and all the rest of it. General accounts of the dismissal mainly ignore the strikes that did occur, and they greatly underestimate the potential for mass industrial action. And there's been insufficient attention given to the genuine fear that the unions would make the country ungovernable for the coalition. Now, the Commonwealth Labor Advisory Committee, chaired by Bob Hawke, and including the federal parliamentary leaders and officers of the party, ACTU leaders, representatives of the public service unions, they all met at John Curtin House in Canberra for several hours on the 11th of November. Hawke and his colleagues flew up from Melbourne, and he's there with Gunston at one stage. Showed you. That meeting passed a resolution that expressed total dedication and determination to have the Whitlam government re-elected. But critically, it rejected the idea of a general strike. There would be no general strike. And militant unions laid the blame for this squarely at the feet of Bob Hawke. The Federal Council of the Builders Labourers Federation found, and I quote, "Words hard to describe your gutless and cowardly statements regarding the current drive to fascism by Fraser. You have only strengthened the current view that you are in the hands of the multinationals." No mincing of words there. Several unions wanted a 24-hour stoppage, others wanted 48 hours, but many expressed their support for Hawke's position. Still, many unionists did walk off the job on the 11th of November to attend hastily organised rallies, and hundreds of thousands went on strike in the days that followed. But an emphasis on fundraising emerged quickly, and as Jen pointed out, this was the Labor Party's third election in 3 years. They were short of money, and we know they were short of money because they went off to the Bath Party looking for money as a scandal broke in 1976 about unorthodox loan raising for the party by David Coombe, among others. So the election campaign, very briefly. The election campaign really began when a bomb blew out Keith McFarlane's right eye. He was a clerk in the Queensland Premier Joe Bjelke-Petersen's Brisbane mailroom on the 19th of November. Just the day was beginning. He called over a man called Gary Cross to look at something, a white envelope addressed to the Premier and marked press release kit. Inside were white wires. Cross put the envelope down and there was a flash and a whoosh that blew a hole in the desk and cut up his face and hand. Another envelope, that one, was sent to Fraser the same day. An X-ray machine caught the bomb before anyone could be hurt. 2 days later, a third went to Kerr's office. Now, the election result... Oops, I'm going the wrong way there. The election result was a massive Liberal National Country Party majority in the House and Senate, and it was a crushing blow for Labor supporters. Many of them felt betrayed, powerless and depressed. Some withdrew into their homes, listening to records on repeat for weeks. Left-wing Canberra academic Humphrey McQueen could not eat for days. Patrick White stopped seeing people. The election result had confirmed everything he had, quote, always hated about Australia. Guido Baracci, whose career in radical politics stretched back to World War I, he was a founding member of the Communist Party in 1920, had come out of retirement as an activist to hand out election material for Labor, wandering the hot streets of Penrith with a sign around his neck. Lugging his heavy sack of paper, you can see where this is going, can't you? Lugging his heavy sack of paper on a hot Penrith summer's day proved too much for Guido. He collapsed and died that night on the 13th of December, just as the political analysts were calling a victory for Fraser and the coalition. So, to conclude, C.V. Wedgwood, wonderful historian, a British historian, said, "History is lived forwards, but is written in retrospect. We know the end before we consider the beginning, and we can never wholly recapture what it was to know the beginning only." Now, we know that Australian democracy wasn't destroyed by the dismissal, but it's possible, I think, to discern in the events that followed the dismissal something of the political order that would take shape in the 1980s. One can especially detect, I think, in the campaigning of Bob Hawke, the early stages, perhaps the middle stages really, of his bid for the Lodge. Hannah Sweeney from Ascot in Queensland wrote at 11 p.m. on election night to congratulate Hawke for the way he'd fought the election. And I quote, "I did not vote for your party, but I admired the spirit of moderation and true democracy which you showed in many of your public speeches and which were dangerously lacking in the statements of some other public figures of both parties. When our country has been so deeply divided, we need responsible leaders to heal our divisions. You have helped do this." Another Liberal voter, Robert Ellis from Mount Waverley in Melbourne, was also impressed by Hawke's conduct during the election night coverage. and I quote, "Both the extreme left and the extreme right of Australian politics have the potential to threaten the Australian people and are to be feared. I believe that you can do more by reason and persuasion to prevent the excesses of both extremes than can almost anyone in Australia. On Saturday, you proved, at least to me, that you are one of the people on whom the future of this country depends." Now, we don't know if Hannah Sweeney or Robert Ellis voted Labor in 1983, but we do know that these citizens saw in Hawke's politics an appeal to that idea of consensus that would form the centrepiece, of course, of his pitch to voters, those, whatever it is, later. For many years, perhaps until about the end of the 20th century, the manner of Whitlam's demise and the character of his response to the dismissal would dominate, I think, collective memory of his government. But that too would fade in time, and today it's the policy legacy and the manner of the man himself, I think, that loom largest. Australians have made and remade events of October to December 1975 in their national imagination. Today, they're more likely to note that Whitlam gave them the chance of a university education than to recall much about the events of the 11th of November. But the people were not bit players or extras in a play acted out by Whitlam, Fraser, Kerr, Barwick and Hawke. They were at the centre of the drama, just as the nature and quality of their democracy was at the centre of the crisis. Yet although the dismissal is still conveniently regarded as the most significant single event in the country's political history, it paradoxically seems to have very little influence on how most of us regard that democracy today. Is it just, Australia's famous complacency at work here, I wonder? Are we so easygoing, so practical, so matter of fact, that we simply decided to put it all behind us? Yet in a world where democracy is now in decay, Australians have been increasingly inclined to celebrate the robustness of their Australian version of democracy with regular and affectionate nodding to the democracy sausage. In 1975, democracy in Australia seemed a much more fragile thing. The basic institutional design of our system remains unchanged from those times. We would perhaps do well to leaven our pride as well as our complacency with a healthy dose of vigilance. Thank you.
Hopefully that triggered many memories for people and also provided new knowledge of what actually went on. It certainly did for me. We've been very privileged to have Jenny and Frank talk about different aspects of the dismissal. We now want to hand over to you for questions, and we want to focus on questions, not commentary. Questions for Frank and Jenny.
I've heard it said that when Hawke was in power, the Americans approached Hawke and apologised for interference during the Whitlam years. No one's mentioned that tonight. Is that actually something that did happen?
What that's probably a reference to is that an emissary of President Carter did ask for a meeting with Gough Whitlam in, I can't remember the exact year, and the meeting was held in a private room at Sydney Airport, and this is all on the record. Richard Butler, who worked for Whitlam at the time, has written about it, and apologised to him without specifically saying that there was American involvement in the events of 1975, but did say that President Carter specifically wanted it passed on to Whitlam that never again would Americans interfere in the Australian electoral process. Now, what that was a specific reference to, as I say, has not been said publicly, and I know that people have tried to get details of it under which generally disappears into the ether and is never seen again. So there was certainly concern on the part of the Americans there was concern over the Whitlam government from the outset at different points. However, there was heightened concern in the couple of weeks leading up to the dismissal because it revealed that a former CIA agent, Richard Stallings, who had worked at Pine Gap, had not been revealed to the Whitlam government as someone who was a CIA operative, which is meant to be the agreed protocol between America and Australia. And Whitlam was absolutely furious that he had been, as he saw it, deceived about CIA work. It's normally meant to be on a list, acknowledged, and, you know, it's not made public, but it's given to the Prime Minister. And it also transpired that Stallings had been renting at a previous time Doug Anthony's house, Doug Anthony being the leader of the Country Party, which Doug Anthony acknowledged. So this fed into the general sense of sort of an unravelling of a range of things before the dismissal. Whitlam was going to announce a question to Doug Anthony, which Doug Anthony had said he would answer in the Parliament, about Richard Stallings, and this led to a flurry of texts, telexes and so on, no, before texts, telexes and telegrams from America, and it was called the greatest security threat that we'd faced, that this detail was going to be announced in the Parliament. So make of that what you will. I'm often asked about the role of the CIA, and I try and stick to, in such a fraught area, what we have actually found. So to me, I never say never, because with the dismissal, why would you, after what we've had revealed. However, you can say there was huge concern. Pine Gap was going to be renewed, was due to be renewed, the lease, in December. So that added to the Americans' concern. I don't believe Whitlam would ever have not renewed it. He was a stickler for proper processes. That's where his fury lay, that he had been misled. And so that was certainly an element. But I think what we have found of the involvement of the Queen, the Governor, the Prince Charles and her private secretary is on the record. We know that now. And we're still awaiting further details about the American involvement.
And to that, I mean, both the heads of both ASIO and ASIS lost their jobs. So there's a real sense of a kind of a deterioration, I guess, of the government's relationship with the security service. And there's I don't think there's any doubt, Jenny, that the US Embassy in Canberra had been particularly worried about the prospect of a Cairns Prime Ministership. You know, Cairns is gone by the time of the dismissal, but earlier in 1975, of course, before he fell over his sort of branch of the Loans affair, you know, he was very much on the rise, and the prospect of him, you know, potentially displacing Whitlam as Prime Minister was certainly something that was worrying the political right generally, and certainly the US Embassy, as I understand it.
Seems like going forward, the biggest problem that this country faces is our constitution, which was written in 1899 and is totally unsuitable for what we're trying to achieve in terms of having an Australian head of state and so forth. And I just wondered if there's any likelihood that your hero countries rewriting their constitutions, and I think we have to do that somehow or other, but I can't see it happening.
Look, I think you're right. It is enormously difficult to change our constitution under the terms of the constitution. But the constitution does contain within it a method of change. It is, and this was what I found so frustrating about discussions about the voice, such as they were, that it was presented as though this was some enormous outrage to our constitution to try and interpose something on it, when the constitution contains within it an avenue for change. It expected and anticipated change. It just made it far too difficult. And the history of our referenda, which is the only way meaningfully we can achieve a change to the constitution, is that the 8 referenda that have succeeded have had bipartisan support. And that's certainly the lesson we must take from the voice, that without bipartisan support, a referendum is not going to succeed. Now, in terms of the Republic, you have the added difficulty of many differences of opinion among Republicans about what form that change should take. Somehow you have to cut through all of that and reach a position where you can gain bipartisan support for, my own preference is for a minimal change, and I think you need to do, in order to avoid what happened in 1975, you need one simple thing. You need the formation of government through the House of Representatives, which we had always assumed was the sacred principle of representative government, is that is where governments are made and unmade. You need that to be effected in the Constitution. Kerr could not have done what he did in 1975 if that was the case. And there are legislative provisions in other jurisdictions, particularly around the wording of Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which specify that. I'm not saying we should have fixed term parliaments by any stretch. I think that's awful. But certainly you could find a form of wording that would ensure that a Governor-General could not override the wishes of the people and the wishes of the House of Representatives on the formation of government. For me, the powers are largely immaterial after that, because they're not. It's not possible for him or her to do particular things. So I think what I would like to see is the government to bring back the Minister for a Republic, Matt Thistlethwaite or someone else, and to start an education campaign, because changing referenda, to put it mildly, changing the Constitution is hard. Winning referendum is hard, but we need to start that process and become accustomed to it.
Yeah, and worth remembering too, I mean, I think 3 of the 8 that got up were all in 1977. One of them was actually a remedy, I suppose, for the issue that Jenny talked about. It was a casual Senate vacancy issue. So the change that got up with bipartisan support in 77 was that what had been a kind of convention that the state government would replace a deceased or retiring senator with someone from the same party is now embedded in the Constitution. Interestingly, it's the only mention of political parties in the Constitution. They're not otherwise there. But of course they had to be mentioned in that amendment if it was going to work. The others were voting, allowing residents, citizens of the territories to vote in referendums. So before that 77 thing, an ACT or Northern Territory voter wouldn't have had a vote for something like the voice referendum. And what was the third? There was a third, I think. Oh yes, it was High Court judges. High Court judges compulsorily retiring at 70. So they were the last changes almost 50 years ago. It's a hard one. I mean, for me, really, the most urgent is actually Section 44(1) in particular, but perhaps Section 44 generally. I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that, maybe about 50% of Australian citizens actually don't qualify to run for Parliament. I wouldn't be confident that I could run for the Parliament with 4 Italian grandparents. I think it's outrageous, absolutely outrageous. Born here, parents born here, barely been to Italy. I mean, it's an absurdity, but that's where we are at the moment. And I think that, to me, is the most important and urgent we face, even more so, I think, than a republic, from my point of view.
And it does mean that, really, to get a referendum passed, let's face it, it's largely Labor governments that can't get them passed because it can't get bipartisan support. So I think a lot of pressure has to be put on the coalition to work better on finding compromise solutions. It does mean change will be minor, but at least it will get done. Sorry, there's a...
In November 1975, I think Tuesday night that the Whitlam government was sacked, so it wasn't a Friday night, and the importance of this, that the school teachers at Cobar High School did adjourn to the golf and bowling club on the Tuesday night instead of the Friday night, because the deputy principal decided we had to go and discuss what had happened in Canberra. No one was particularly political, but as the drinking went on, he told us all that a republic was inevitable as a result of this, and we probably went home quite happily drunk at the fact that the Whitlam government had been sacked, because it would inevitably lead to an Australian republic. Now, in the last week, we've been faced with a so-called left-wing Australian Prime Minister who must know about Prince Charles's involvement in the letters involving so-called abandoning any prospect of an Australian republic in his lifetime. So it seems that the wishes of the many people in 1975 are not going to bear fruit for another 50 years.
You're so right. I think England might be a republic before we are. And then legally, I'm not sure where that leaves us. Can we still have a king or a queen if they don't?
The impact of the dismissal on the Republican issue is pretty ambiguous. So polling, as you'd expect, I suppose, in a polarised situation, polling for the Republic was not good in the aftermath of the dismissal, but of course it did create a cohort of highly motivated people, no doubt like those down at the bowling club in Cobar, who really did carry their republicanism forward for many years. And you can think of figures like Tom Keneally, indeed Malcolm Turnbull, I would have thought, who was outraged, wasn't he, by the dismissal. The key moments really around the Republic, often overlooked, is the late 80s, because the polling in the late 80s says two things. It says only a minority wanted a republic in the late 80s, around the time of the bicentenary. You couldn't get over 50% at that stage. However, you had over 50%, and it was climbing, saying that the monarchy is of no importance. You know, is the monarchy important to Australia? A majority were saying no by the late 80s, and I think that they're the ingredients that really, I think, fed into a lot of the republicanism of the 90s. It's very associated with the changes in the 1980s more perhaps than the 70s.
I was in Walgett in 1975 working for the Department of Main Roads, and it was a very popular decision to have the Whitlam government opposed. I remember going to a Christmas party after the election, and the celebration was quite significant. I just thought that as a postscript, we can make a positive out of the fact that the Australian community has been able to live with the decision and the negative aspects of it, but that we as a democracy did survive, and that we do continue to work towards representation and acceptance of our government as it is.
I think that's absolutely right. What I think it also showed that, I think, as Frank said, it's good to be vigilant. I look at what is happening in America at the moment, totally within the confines, apparently, of legality and power, and the way in which that's structured being used in what many would see as extreme ways in their own communities by the president. And I think it is a timely reminder that an institution structure politically is only as good as the people in it, and that, as Frank said, the circumstances of the dismissal are still there. The capacity for another dismissal is still there. And I do think that question about what are quite extraordinary powers that currently can be seen as resting with the Governor-General, should they choose to use it, and they include things like being, the commander of the armed forces, being able to choose the members of the Executive Council, clearly from what Kerr did, being able to choose the Prime Minister and the government. I mean, these are not appropriate for an appointed official, and I think they need to be tidied up. They need to be strengthened. We shouldn't become complacent that because, thankfully, most people don't behave as dishonourably and deceitfully as John Kerr did, that we can always rely on that. And I think we do well to remember that when we look to a republic and find ways to tighten. It's only a few things that need to be tightened around that, but to ensure that a Governor-General can't again take their powers literally and act on them.
There's also, the Victorians removed, this is under Steve Bracks a few years ago, they reformed their constitution, much easier, you can do it by Parliament down there in the States, to remove the power of the Legislative Council to block supply, which is quite interesting. And the world didn't end down in Victoria, as far as I know, as a result.
Is it time to get rid of the Senate entirely?
I'd say no. The Senate actually performs a really valuable and important democratic function in a way that I don't think most people would have imagine. We owe some of it back in 75. We owe a lot of it actually to the groundwork done by Lionel Murphy around the committee system. Because it's not controlled usually by the government of the day, it has an incredibly vigorous committee system. I mean, you know, Senate estimates has its faults and its problems, but it is a really significant accountability measure. So my own view actually is that the Senate now performs a useful sort of counterbalancing or check and balance type function that we often associate with the United States. That probably, I wouldn't have seen coming in the 80s when I probably started, first thinking about these kinds of things.
Yeah, I agree with Frank on that. I think certainly what Lionel Murphy introduced in the late 60s and 70s before he went to the High Court was to do a much stronger structure of committees so the Senate could become, as he saw it, a genuine House of Review. Others would argue he inadvertently gave it delusions of grandeur because it gave it a role and a function beyond what it had done before, but it is an important role and function. I think the key problem with the Senate is that it has the power to block supply. And that again is a contested legal question. And it bothers me that all of these questions in the aftermath of the dismissal kept coming back to lawyers. There were far too many lawyers because the Constitution sets up a structure of a political system. Politics plus law. And too much of the politics got, and I mean that as political scientists, not party politics, lost in terms of the theory about how a democratic process works, how responsible works, how the Westminster system works. That tended to get lost and submerged in a view, but it's technically legal. That doesn't make it right. And much of this was wrong. And I think the blocking of supply, there's a lot of argument among lawyers about whether that power even exists for the Senate to block supply. But again, it's been done, it wasn't challenged, and it is now seen as settled law that the Senate can block supply, and I think that's a problem.
What a rich and enjoyable discussion. Would you join me please and thank Jenny and also Robin for doing a lot of the work behind the scenes to make tonight. If you would like a broad sweep of Australian political history from pre-European times right through to Albanese and Scott Morrison, that is very readable, enjoyable and at times hilariously funny, can I suggest you put this on the Christmas list? This is Frank Bongiorno's book, Dreamers and Schemes, and Australian political history is full of dreamers and schemers. Secondly, can I suggest, you saw on the screen earlier on the Palace Letters, but this 2-volume biography of Gough Whitlam is absolute gold. If you want an understanding of the political situation in Australia in the 1960s and the 70s, once you start volume 1, you will not put it down. It is outstanding and just a wonderful account of those times, and a great credit to you, Jenny, to do this. And thank you so much for enriching our lives with this sort of hard work, to both Jenny and to Frank. So thank you very much. Last time we were here, I said that our annual lecture in conjunction with the university on Australia's role in the Asia Pacific would be presented by Maurice Payne. Unfortunately, she is no longer able to do that, but Pat Conroy, the Minister for the Pacific, has agreed to lecture. That will be at the university on November the 20th at 6 p.m. But if you are on our mailing list, you will get notified of that. And if you're not on our mailing list, make sure you are before the end of this evening. So So I look forward. That's the last of our events at this here for the year. Next event will be at the university on November the 20th, and then we start again in March of 2026. Look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much.